Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the work of Ojibwe poet George Kenney, whom I'm reading out of Native Poetry in Canada. So a lot of Kenney's work focuses on storytelling, narratives of typical Indigenous people in the contemporary settler, colonialist, and capitalist world. And I say typical, what I mean by that is not necessary. So it's quite possible that these are inspired by real specific individuals, but they also represent broad categories of Indigenous experience in contemporary North America. The challenges faced by Indigenous people who have disproportionately high rates of alcoholism, disproportionately high rates of poverty, disproportionately high rates of homelessness, etc., precarious employment, things like this. And so, even if the poems are not inspired by specific singular individuals, they represent what what's his name? In the book, The Things They Carried, the author of whom I cannot remember off the top of my head, I want to say Brian is in there, but he presents this idea of story truth, right? So this is the idea that even though this is not necessarily historical fact in the sense of this literally directly happened to me, it's the truth of someone's experience. And in being the truth of someone's experience, it is representative of a broader category of truth. So I think this is, to a certain extent, what Kenney's work does, is it reflects the truth of Indigenous people's struggles under settler colonialism and capitalism, even if it's not specific, even if there's no singular individual who can put their hand up and say, yes, that is exactly what happened to me. It is nonetheless true on a deeper, more philosophical level. So I'll start with this poem, Rubby at Central Park. In the green beauty of Central Park, between Edmonton and Carleton streets, every night some of Winnipeg's 30,000 Indians find acceptance with a 10 fluid ounce bottle of rubbing alcohol. Rubby, while eventually to burn a hole through the drinker's intestines, even when diluted with Fanta or Coca-Cola, is as good as any brand of whiskey to start forgetting. The personnel man at the Bay or any other employment office took a look at clothes one didn't have 4 bits to wash with, or maybe just said to himself, oh, a wino, look at his scarred face, and said a sorry he didn't mean. Right, so again, there's a generic component to this, right? Some of Winnipeg's 30,000 Indians, right? So it's not necessarily that this is the story of a specific person, and it's not necessarily that there's a specific personnel man at the Bay or any other employment office who turned this particular character away, but it is a broad category of experience, right? Again, particularly in urban areas, Indigenous people face disproportionately high rates of homelessness, poverty, unemployment or precarious employment, etc., and often fall into drug or alcohol abuse as coping mechanisms for that. And those problems reflect long-term socio-cultural structures of anti-Indigenous bias, stereotyping about Indigenous people being, for instance, lazy or prone to theft, prone to alcoholism, etc., etc. And so these things become sort of self-reinforcing stereotypes, right? As Indigenous people are turned away from stable, reliable, long-term work, they fall further and further into poverty and therefore turn more and more to alcohol and drugs as coping mechanisms. They're more likely to steal to survive, etc., because they are impoverished systematically, not because of any personal flaws in their character necessarily. I mean, obviously, Indigenous people are human beings like the rest of us, and some of them are personally flawed, but that is not an issue of race or ethnicity. That's an issue of humanity. But the systematic disenfranchisement and economic disempowerment of Indigenous people is a systemic issue. And again, this is some of the things that Kenny is dealing with in this. Another one that is less dark, but still represents a widespread trend among Indigenous people is poor JW. So this deals with religious proselytization, right? This experience of very strongly felt religious beliefs and the sort of central role that plays in coping with issues of displacement, poverty, suffering, etc., for many Indigenous people. So this is poor JW. A Sandy Lake Cree postcard photographic plate of the city implanted on his brain. He, trying to cross Yonge Street at 5 p.m., was collared by a Jehovah's Witness. Poor JW, he didn't know. That lost-looking Cree is a devil-casting-out preacher, a brother of Jesus. Who'll save who? My 2 bits on the Sandy Lake Cree, dumb in the ways of the city, but fluent in all tongues when it comes to the Lord and the Bible. Poor JW. So I actually think that's quite a fun one. But again, it is this element, and it's systematic, again, with impoverished people, not just Indigenous people. Appalachia is another great example of this, right? Like my bachelor's and PhD were both earned in West Virginia. I've spent a good portion of my life there, and so I'm very interested in Appalachian culture. And groups like the Holy Rollers, for instance, which had a big sway in Appalachia, evangelical Christians, Baptists, Presbyterians have a big sway in Appalachia, in part because religion offers theoretically an antidote to poverty. Right? So because one, especially Christianity, to greater or lesser extents, depending on the specific species of Christianity you're dealing with, the fundamental idea that anyone can be saved, and even that the poor are privileged over the rich, that's a very appealing idea to people who live in poverty continually. The idea that your suffering in this lifetime will be repaid in the hereafter is a very appealing idea. This is incidentally part of the reason why Karl Marx said that religion is the opiate of the masses. This is the same fundamental belief behind Nietzsche's idea that Abrahamic religions, Judaism and Christianity especially, are rooted in a slave mentality, right? That Christian religion especially trains people to accept suffering in this life, to accept poverty, to accept these difficulties, because they will be rewarded in heaven. And that's true of many indigenous communities as well. There are strong religious movements, Christian religious movements, in part because of that promise of salvation, not just in spite of, but because of poverty, suffering, etc. in this world. So, while it's quite a fun poem, it's quite a sort of fun reversal of expectations that this Jehovah's Witness gets out-witnessed by this Cree. There's also a dark element to it again. So, yeah. All right, the last one that I'm going to read to you of Kenny's poems is I Don't Know This October Stranger. And this is a sort of broader, at the same time, it's a sort of broader and more narrow poem, because this is rooted in the poet persona's personal experience. It is a first-person poem. And so in that sense, it's not the broad typology of indigenous peoples, and yet it is a universal experience of growing older, of no longer recognizing oneself, etc., because one has undergone changes. So this is I Don't Know This October Stranger. I don't know this October stranger, each dawn groping for an alarm clock, selecting a blue polyester suit that used to belong to an Indian from the back forests of northwestern Ontario. This autumn stranger washes a once familiar face, runs wind-burnt fingers over a cowlick-topped head of black hair, the exact image of a man I swear I once knew. This October stranger adjusts his blue tie, flips through his documents before sliding them into a $40 briefcase, and then rides off on a rocking subway train to his second-story office on Eglinton Avenue E in Toronto. I don't know this October stranger that writes his stories and poems as if Chaucer himself was kicking him along, never letting him rest, this Indian dedicated to becoming published. I don't know this October stranger that left a love of 3 years behind without a kiss, this autumn stranger that knew his 14-year-old sister would be left all alone in a boarding school and yet migrated south. I don't know this October stranger. So, I mean, there are elements here that are, again, typical of contemporary indigenous experiences, right? This sense of displacement, this sense of being exiled from one's home, going from northwestern Ontario to Toronto, left a love of 3 years behind without a kiss, this autumn stranger that knew his 14-year-old sister would be left all alone in a boarding school, right? The destruction of families in indigenous communities is incredibly prevalent, because often on reservations and tribal, nation, or band lands, there are fairly few economic opportunities, and so often indigenous people need to leave in order to seek economic opportunities elsewhere, particularly in major cities like Toronto, Winnipeg, Calgary, Quebec, or Montreal, Vancouver, places like this in Canada, and in the United States, often more sort of central Midwestern and Western cities, mostly because along the East Coast, we settler colonialists were much more thorough at actually wiping out and displacing indigenous peoples, whereas in the Western United States, many more indigenous cultures survive. But anyway, so we do have those elements to it, right? But it also is this very sort of personal poem of the speaker no longer recognizing the person that they were, right? That sense of loss of youth, that loss of probably idealism, although it's not necessarily explicit that that's what it is in the poem, right? But this sense of, I know who I once was, but I am no longer that person, right? That's a very universal experience. And yet, again, it is tied to these specific experiences that are more representative of the struggles of Indigenous people,